My name's Tim Plyming. I am a content producer. The work I do at the moment is particularly helping brands and arts and cultural organisations think about how they can tell their own stories and exercise their own content. And that's really what we're going to be doing in this session together. We're really thinking about the digital first world that we now live in. I strongly believe we're in the middle of an industrial revolution in the way that content is consumed, the way that content is shared, and that I have felt now for a few years offers a whole host of organisations enormous opportunity. There's a bit of challenge in there, but is enormous opportunity. And I sort of realised that particularly working from a sort of traditional broadcast background. And as I engaged with organisations and brands that had their own story to tell, I thought, actually, they can do this directly themselves rather than always just going through the prism of a broadcaster. So that's the stuff we're going to explore. We're going to have a panel discussion, and then, as I say, I hope at something like 10 to, we'll have a time for a few questions. And so it's on to the panel. And I have to say, because this actually replaces another session we were going to have, these guys have, at fairly short notice, come and are willing to share their expertise. And I feel enormously humbled when I had their notes back to say, of course, I'd love to do this. What's the fee? There's no fee. I'll think about it. I am humbled by the generosity of people who will come and share their expertise, and so I feel we're all in their debt. So on to the panel. I'm going to start with Nigel Smith. Nigel is the head of content at Futurelearn. Futurelearn is an amazing organisation born out of the Open University, creating amazing online courses for students, for learners right around the world. Nigel's background: he was previously the editor of digital at Radio 4 and Radio 4 Extra, previously doing a similar job at 5 Live and an illustrious career before that. Russell Smith is the editor of digital development at the BBC for BBC News. Russell has been editor of the Africa service. Africa Online after a period, hugely experienced person, also helping really to guide the BBC and BBC News through this industrial revolution that we're living through. And finally, Giles Wilson. Giles is actually the founder of a fantastic new consultancy that is almost a week old, Harpoon Productions. And Giles is going to be bringing his expertise and experience to a market that's wider than the BBC, because Giles was previously at the BBC. I actually knew Giles when he was features editor at BBC News, so he was the man you had to bribe to get a BBC story placed from somewhere else. But it's fantastic to have the three guys with us. And we're going to get immediately into a conversation. But before we do that, I wanted to play a piece of film. And I think we should have it. If I look through the door that says private, I think we should have it ready to play. And it's an example of the kind of work that I'm involved in at the moment, which is branded content, brands that have a story to tell. And this is an award-winning piece of content as an example of how a brand creates their own content. It's relatively sickly in its approach. You know, this is branded content, you understand. But I think it's really, really interesting. It's been hugely shared, many multiple millions of shares. It's award-winning, but it's an example of a brand telling a story. And I thought as a little breaker that we'd watch that. So let's watch that together. That actually created a huge campaign in the States. So in America, that created a huge movement, a huge campaign. I find that at the moment particularly interesting. Guys, on to our conversation. I wanted to start at the conference today with thinking about how things have changed over the last 40 years. And I wonder if you could just identify the ways, the big themes really, for the changes that we're seeing on how audiences consume content. So what really, over the last 40 years, are really the big shifts for the way that we as consumers have really consumed content? Russell, can I start with you?
Yeah, I think if you go back a long way, we had some really kind of restricted opportunities to tell stories. It was newspapers, it was BBC, one or two TV and radio stations. And then as the kind of internet started to expand, there were more opportunities, but they tended to be targeted at a general audience. So the BBC News website, for example, it's one website for everybody. And as time's gone on, I think those opportunities to kind of target particular audiences have grown and expanded. So whether that's through data or particular kind of platforms that are targeted at particular audiences, younger audiences, you have an opportunity now to almost one-to-one communicate and tell an appropriate story for the audience that you're interested in. I think that's certainly a big thing that we're thinking about in BBC and BBC News is what can we do to better make news relevant to individuals? And I think that applies across the board. So, yeah.
Personalisation, is that one of the themes for you?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things. So I did a postgrad journalism course, and I remember going around the table, introducing ourselves, Goldsmiths, and why are you doing this course? What do you want to do when you finish the course? Every single person in the room wanted to work for a magazine or a newspaper. We didn't even think about the internet. And I think pretty much every single person on that course ended up working on the internet in some way. And obviously, as what happens a lot when you're involved, you get the alumni organisation ask you to come and speak to the next generation of students, and just the amount of actual. It's not just the one-to-one conversation; it's actually the ability for anybody to create content. I think that is the massive changer. Is that if I'd have had access to a blog when I was a teenager. My whole outlook going into, would I have even bothered thinking I need some sort of journalism qualification to start a career? So I think that opening access and the opportunities is a massive changer. And then that has now challenged the bigger media organisations because they needn't be the only people who are developing great content, and people aren't necessarily deciding to choose those people to tell their stories with.
Thank you. Giles.
Yeah, so I must say, from being inside the BBC, it doesn't feel like it's a massively strong position in terms of being able to tell the best stories. Clearly, we've got an ability to, I mustn't say we, clearly the BBC has got an ability to put those stories in front of a larger number of people than anybody else. But I think if you were one of the BBC's competitors, I think you would feel much more challenged by your ability to not to tell the stories but to actually get them in front of people. So yes, you're right, Nigel. Of course, the means of production are now available to everybody. Pretty much the same, the same tools would be used on a student on their laptop as would be used for BBC broadcast material. The same programs, the same MacBooks. It would be the same things. But it's not just the means of production. It's the channels to audience which makes such a big difference. And we know, you see a nice video, you don't know who it's made by, and then you see on Facebook, yeah, it's been watched by 40 million people. And you think, how on earth has that happened? And it's not from anybody who's got any established audience at all. It's just completely democratized the whole thing, which is brilliant for everybody who wants to make their own content. But it also means that the barriers are so much higher. There's so much more noise. Well, there are different kinds of barriers, but there's so much more noise. It comes down in the end to your skills of storytelling and your skills of production.
Thank you. So look, in the audience, we will have lots of organisations represented who I think represent that new breed of content company. People with stories to tell, people with content inherently in what they're doing. I'm one of those people that believes the NHS could be one of the biggest content companies in the country if it rethought how it did the NHS. But, in the audience, we'll have lots and lots of companies represented who could be, and organisations and companies who could be content companies. What are the opportunities, for people who are sitting on stories to tell, on content? What really, in the shift as you see it, are really the big opportunities? If you were sitting with them and saying, I'd really be thinking about this, what's the thing? Nigel, can I start with you?
I think a really important thing to think about is, I think one of the pitfalls people often think about is, okay, well, we've got these stories to tell. We want to be more digital. It's like, okay, well, now we've got to make a website or an app, and then kind of just go down that black hole without thinking, actually, there are all these brilliant platforms to use. So without wanting to do too much self-promotion, but Futurelearn, the company that I work for, is what we do is provide a platform for to teach free online courses. Most of these are taught by universities, but also healthcare organisations or people like the BFI are making courses. And one of the things that we have to really do when we're working with people, academics, teaching these courses, is to tell them that, you know, this is a new medium. Although we call these things courses, they are quite unlike anything you've ever taught in a classroom. And we really promote the idea of storytelling as a really important way to disseminate the information and kind of educational content. So I think quite a lot of it is like looking for brilliant platforms and then kind of reconfiguring your brain a bit to think, okay, well, I'm used to telling a story in this way. The actual story is the same, but the ways of telling it have evolved and different. And, you know, I spend quite a lot of time talking to academics who, some of them take to it like that, and some of them don't. One of the things I often remind them is that, as Tim said, that we're owned by the Open University, and many of you will remember, you know, you'll have seen Open University TV lectures in the past, which look, you know, very archaic. But one of the things, you know, academics still make TV and radio programs, and if an academic comes to, you know, the BBC and wants to make a radio program, they will be really consultative with the directors and producers of those programs because they know they're in a whole different world. And I think because people are so used to using the internet, they kind of forget that actually they think they can do everything, and actually there is a lot of knowledge and different skills required to sort of tell stories on that different medium.
I'm going to say something that maybe isn't necessarily obvious. What I would say is kind of learn from what others are doing, but don't just tick boxes and copy what others are doing. And this is, you know, the great skill of someone like Giles, who ran our magazine for so many years, was he didn't copy what others were doing. He was original. And it's not always easy to get originality. So don't just tick boxes about a bit. That film you showed was great, but you know, there's a danger you tick an emotional box and you try and get things. What I'd say is focus on what's compelling about the story. Yes, try and work through what are people's individual stories. It's still about what matters. Why does this matter to me as an individual? And if you know the audience you're targeting, why does it matter to that audience? And focus on that, but then try and be original.
Yeah, very helpful. Thanks, Giles.
Well, so I mean, it would be tempting, I think, to follow everybody to go into Facebook and Facebook Instant Articles just because they have such a direct, powerful relationship with so many people. I would say probably they can be a tool that's used, but actually people shouldn't ignore the power of having stories properly told on their own websites. And I think that is something, you get people into your space, and if you do it well, then you've got all sorts of onward journeys that you can make. That's one thing I would do. The other thing, video is clearly very good at getting attention in social media, but I don't think there's much that can beat podcasts at the moment for people's appetite for engaging content. And I think there is a huge, I mean, we just see what's happening in the US, and it's not really happening here yet, but there's a great opportunity for podcasts to grow and to threaten, really. I think Radio 4, I don't know how much Radio 4 is thinking about the threat of podcasts. Right, okay, well, so I think those are two things that I would think about. And the example of the Dove film, I think, is fascinating because they weren't pushing their brand. The relationship between the publisher and the content there was really tangential at the end. And for people in this room, I think that's that how the messaging of the publisher should relate to the message itself. I think that's getting that right is a real challenge. And the whole, I mean, there's a lot of talk about content marketing, but when it's done badly, you can see that it's been done badly, and when it's done right, it's it's brilliant. You say, oh, did you see that Dove film? That's brilliant. And it's all about, you come out of it thinking much better of them. I would love to see social justice campaigns run by church organisations, not as a means of publicity, but just for the good of increasing social justice.
No, that's really helpful. And I spend a lot of time in my job convincing organisations and brands that the customer might not meet a product or service for quite a few months. I mean, that actually there is an inherent value in actually creating the content and being in the conversation and that has proved, for Dove, that certainly proved the case when they started that campaign. Let me just push one thing further, because the other thing that we're experiencing a lot is just how competitive that kind of content space is now. And so from BuzzFeed to Vice News to competition on YouTube and Facebook, with more and more people now entering this market, give me just a quick fire, and Giles, I'll start this way and we'll work our way round. Just a quick fire, couple of things that are really the tips for content that cuts through in this sort of uber competitive world. We talk about clickbait content, but the sort of stuff that you see, for any readers of the Daily Mail, I'm not myself, but I hear from friends who are, on the right-hand side, the kind of clickbait content. But, what are some of those things that really help content cut through in a really competitive space?
So my experience is to avoid gimmicks at all costs, because you might get one click, but you'll never get another one if people think that they're being tricked into clicking things. So we were very strict with ourselves when we were at the BBC. There's kind of the internal market of the BBC, where you've got lots of different divisions producing content, and you want your bit to stand out more than anybody else's. So it's kind of like, the internet in microcosm, if you like, because you've really got to make your bit sing. And so the way we did that was we were very disciplined to say, right at the outset of producing a bit of content, what's the text that we're going to promote this with? What are the 8 words? Why is anybody ever going to click on this? And if you do that, it really refines your thinking about what's a clear editorial idea. And that follows the whole way through the process. So then you have something which is actually clear and quite refined at the end of it. So it's a simple trick, but it works.
Yeah, no, very helpful. Thank you. Russ?
That takes me right back to my days as Africa editor, and I thought I was in direct competition with Giles on the magazine to try and get that prime spot on the front page. And he usually won. I think that's right. And what I'd also say is, again, I'm going to go back to platform and audience. Think about your audience. So I heard a guy running content marketing for Babbel at a conference, and he's in Germany, Ed Wood, and he talked through his strategy really well. So you've probably all noticed it on airlines and things, and in Outbrain ads and things, how Babbel try and get you to learn a language. But they've done some really clever things where they get some of these guys who can speak 8-10 languages, and they promote something around how quickly can they learn a new language, and then they follow it through with videos, and it becomes really compelling content that's very shareable. And it absolutely hits what they're trying to do, is get people to sign up to learn new languages, and they've really thought it through carefully, and they are creating compelling content based on kind of their aims, and it really works. I think Manchester City are an interesting example as well. They're obviously they're a slightly kind of up-and-coming kind of football club trying to get a global audience, and they've got a lot of money. But they've produced some really good content around Manchester City stories, where a lot of fans can't get to Manchester to see the games, but they can tell their stories of how Manchester City's impacted on their lives, and it's been quite successful, and it gets shared a lot. So again, they're thinking about kind of how they can do that.
Yeah, I think just to kind of reiterate Giles's point, really, is just really thinking about the medium. So when I worked at Radio 4, one of the big challenges we had there, and kind of to your point about how our Radio 4, I've not been there for a few years, so they might be taking it more seriously than they did when I worked there. But Radio 4 programs have willfully obscure titles quite often, but very funny, plays on words, which if you're just seeing that, in a tweet, utterly meaningless. Whereas if they'd have thought, actually there is an audience for this program who is going to consume it digitally, they might have used sort of Giles's maxim of actually thinking, what are the words that we're going to use to describe this thing? And now in my current job working with academics, if you're developing a course based on, that you've taught for 20 years, and people come to your university and they find it in the prospectus, there's a huge amount of context before you get to that particular course. You've decided what university you're going to, you've decided what department it is, but again, not thinking about actually, well, this thing needs to exist in a really short amount of time and have absolute clarity on what it's about, because the best content in the world is nobody's going to find it if it's really not clear what's at the end of that click.
Thank you. And Nigel, I've had experience of how you are essentially changing the way that academics think about their content. I mean, Futurelearn is, my experience is it's doing that. All right, guys, we have time for 2 questions. I told you it would be quick fire. So we have time for 2 questions. So the first 2 hands I see are the ones you can ask. Thank you, madam. And one other, if there is one. It says 2. Thank you. So there's one here, there's one there. And then, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to connect you with your sandwiches. So please, thank you.
Michaela Youngson, I work for the Methodist Church. I just wonder, with the narrowing down of targets, if there's a danger of self-curation, which means people are not seeing beyond what they automatically buy into already. So they're not actually going to... I know it's not our job to make people grow, but I think that is part of it.
Yeah, I saw an experiment, a tool which had been devised by the Washington Post, I think, called Red Feed, Blue Feed. And this demonstrates the different news feeds that the different sides in the States are getting. And the stories that are being presented to them, sometimes they align. Most of the time, they're telling completely different worldviews. I don't know the answer to it, but it is a risk, and it's reinforcing the things you know already. There's no... there's no way to see to sense check even the things that you're hearing. I honestly don't know the answer to it. Russell knows the answer.
I don't know the answer. I know it's called the filter bubble. That's the term that we've coined for it, and we certainly discuss it in the BBC because we think one of the BBC's jobs is to try and burst people's filter bubbles. And the referendum was a classic case where people's filter bubbles left a lot of people shocked by the results of the referendum. So it's an interesting challenge, and certainly the kind of ideas we've been thinking about is how can you burst that filter bubble? How can you lure people in and then kind of challenge them at the same time? And I'd expect you to be all thinking about that as well.
I'll take the next question. Half the challenge is sometimes knowing what it's called, but we all now know what it's called. Brilliant. James, final question.
Yeah,
Thank you.
only just a thought, and I'd be interested to get views on, is that those 8 words I think are key, but I've noticed that now my Twitter feed is just full of pictures. So you need an image to go with those 8. And I wonder if you've just got any thoughts on, I think from a freelance point of view, if you're with the BBC, you probably have access to a big library and that kind of thing. I don't have that. I now don't post anything on my blog without a picture. Finding a picture that's royalty-free or that I need to pay for or whatever, that's quite a big issue. I wonder if that's just, as a hook, it's not just the 8 words, it's an image that promises what is representative of the story you're trying to tell. I wonder if you've got any quick thoughts on that.
Very good. Nigel, I'm going to come to you first, Giles, and then going to come to you.
I think it's a really good point. I'm not sure I've got any great wisdom to share. Although I think there's something interesting about the way that text and words are used really, really well in a lot of those, a lot of stuff that, that kind of, the stuff that you'll see in your Twitter feed won't just be an image. It will be a combination of a photograph, which could be quite stock and cheap, with, some really compelling text as well. So I think there's some interesting ways to sort of think around it a little bit. But I kind of agree with your point of how important it is.
Yeah, don't be tempted by black and white photos. You think you've got a beautiful Magnum photo of something, well, you couldn't use a Magnum photo in your feed, but you think you've got a really clear, strong black and white image, it won't be seen.
I think you need to think about video a lot more. I think increasingly it's about video, and we've all got many of us have a smartphone. It's the most powerful kind of tool that we could have dreamed of, and that's happened in the last few years. I've been on a course recently, and yes, we've built some software around it, but we can do everything on this now that we used to be able to do with equipment that costs tens of thousands of pounds, and it's incredible the power in these. So don't make excuses.
Very good. Guys, we're going to wrap there because you have to go to your lunch. These guys, again, have just shared their wisdom incredibly generously. I certainly feel like I've been at a very short fire masterclass. So will you join me in thanking the panel?